Welcome to the ECPR PRX panel. We are really glad to see that there is interest for the topic. As a co-chief editor, I welcome you together with my co-chief editor, Alexandra Segerberg. We have been running and we opened the journal, we founded the journal together with the CPR just 2 years ago with the support of Taylor and Francis, who Price is our manager with the journal. And I'm delighted to introduce just today the reason behind this panel. We opened with a great hope of reaching out beyond the same regions and areas, institutions. It came out at a time of transition for publications, more and more open access. And we have also been supported by European grants that are asking for funded research going open access. And we are subsidized by the CPR that kindly also support publication cost. What has happened? It has happened that we have met challenges and our articles are published take a shorter time because we don't have any hard copies. They go through a tripod blind review and they go through the same process as any other article, but actually whenever it's ready to be published and it goes through the review process, it takes much less to be published. So it gives more opportunities also for access for young researchers. At the same time, we find that accessibility is not the same across different areas, across different institutions. There are also issues with open access about credibility, legitimacy, and predatory publishers as well. At the same time, if we look at downloads and access across countries, we find more or less the same countries accessing open access as it happens with traditional publishers. So we are really glad that we are reaching out and we are receiving submissions also from different countries, Ghana, Japan, Uzbekistan. But at the same time, what we would like to see and we would like to discuss today is how to be more inclusive and how to support diversity. So I leave the floor to our chair, our panel chair, Andrea Powell, and to the panelists, Nadia Brown, who is a colleague, a professor at the University of Georgetown, and is also the lead editor of Politics, Groups and Identity, and co-editor of Monkey Cage. Euris van Rossum, Director of Research Integrity. Taavi Sundell, who is one of our authors, a researcher at the Finnish Institute in the Middle East. And I invite you to access his article because he makes a great contributions on open access. And Paul Totten, who is Chief Product and Technology Officer at Taylor and Francis. So thanks a lot for being here. And I leave the floor to Andrea. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simona, and may I add my warm welcome to you all to this panel session today. As Simona said, my name is Andrea Powell, and I act as the Outreach Director for the STM Association. And my main role, the main part of that role is to be the Publisher Coordinator for the Research for Life initiative. And I'll be talking a little bit more about Research for Life as we go through our panel. But I think I can safely and confidently say that we're going to have a fascinating and lively discussion on the topic of the democratization of knowledge today. Our speakers come at this topic from very different perspectives, and they will each bring some fascinating insights, I'm sure, into how the ideals of open scholarship and open access and broader concepts of open research are actually playing out in the real world. So the topic we're talking about this afternoon, it trips nicely off the tongue. It sounds very compelling, the democratization of knowledge. But what do we actually mean by this concept? And what are the lived experiences of those who are either on the receiving end of efforts to improve the openness, inclusion and equity of scholarship, or those who are working to achieve such outcomes on their behalf? What lessons have we learned along the way? And what advice can we pass on to those who strive to improve access, opportunity, and diversity in their publications and in their research endeavours? Is the reality of open scholarship an exclusively positive one, or does it create new challenges for us to overcome? So to get us started, I'd like to invite each of the panelists to briefly introduce themselves and to say just a couple of words about why the topic matters to them. I'll kick off by saying that it matters to me because the programme I work for, Research for Life, was set up 20 years ago specifically to address a growing knowledge gap between the industrialised nations of the global north and the lower and middle income countries of the south. So equality of access to knowledge sits at the heart of what we do. What we're realising more recently is that equality of access is not the same as equality of participation. So this is where the angle I bring to this discussion, but I'd like to hand over now to Nadia to introduce herself to you.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, where I'm from in Washington, D.C. I'm Nadia Brown. I am the lead editor of Politics, Groups, and Identities, which is a new journal of the Western Political Science Association. We're only about 9 years old, and we were started as really a revolutionary journal. There were no mainstream journals in political science that dealt with issues that affected marginalized groups and communities and the study of politics. The Western Political Science Association is an association that has a deep legacy and lineage in feminist politics, immigration, and Latinx politics, but the members of the association did not have an outlet to publish the kind of work that they were doing. So the journal was started in response to the lack of publishing opportunities for people that do this kind of research to find a publication home.
Thank you very much, Nadia. How about, let's hear next from Euris.
Yes, hello. Thank you, Andrea, and thank you for being able to participate in this interesting session. So my name is Euris van Folsom. I'm the Director of Research Integrity for STM. So in case you don't know STM, it's the International Association for Scientific, Technical, and Medical Publishers. We have over 140 members representing about 2/3 of published content worldwide, and our members include societies, small, large, commercial, non-commercial publishers. Our mission is to work together with various partners in the scholarly ecosystem by developing standards and technology to ensure that research is of high quality, is trustworthy, is accessible, and research integrity is a very important part here. So in my role, I work towards research integrity in various ways, developing standards, for example, around transparency of the publication process, developing technology to help combat some of the challenges we have in terms of research integrity, data manipulation, image manipulation, for example, but also looking at new technologies and what impact they can have on research integrity and accessibility and openness of science in general. One example is artificial intelligence, and I'm sure we'll talk about it later in the session, which has great potential, but also dangers towards accessibility and access to research.
Thanks, Euris. Let's hear now from Taavi.
Hey all, and also thanks for inviting me for this panel. So I'm Taavi Sundell. I'm a researcher at the Finnish Institute in the Middle East. Normally I would be in Beirut, but now I'm in Helsinki as Beirut is quite literally unlivable at the moment. Hopefully I'll be back there in a few weeks' time. But anyways, I'm also a doctoral student at the University of Helsinki, where I'm hopefully soon done with my PhD thesis, which looks into different aspects of political economy of higher education and science. And I think what got me interested into these questions or the articles, for example, open access, is that in Finland or in Helsinki, or specifically at the department where I'm based, people have always been critical about democratization or de-democratization of universities and higher education. But the debates always sort of, at some point, I I started to think that they're not paying attention to the big things that are happening, for example, the transformations in scholarly publishing, and instead of focusing on smaller issues like who gets to sit on the board of the department and so on and so forth. And I'm not saying that that's not important, but I think there's huge transformations going on in scholarly publishing. And if you're interested in democratization of academia, I think you should pay focus to these transformations. And then also, briefly to conclude, while doing my PhD, I spent 3 years in Jordan, and now I've been living 3 years almost in Beirut, in Lebanon. And it was interesting then when you sort of stepped out from the confines of the pushy Western academia that we have in Finland to some extent still to this day, that you saw these questions from a different angle, and that brought the sort of global aspect of these questions more clearly into focus. And hopefully we can talk about that as well today. But thanks, looking forward to it.
Thank you, Taavi. And last but definitely not least, I'd like to introduce Paul, or I'll ask him to introduce himself and explain his interest in the subject.
Thank you. It's great to be with you all today. I'm joining you from sunny Tampa, Florida, where I reside. I'm the Chief Product and Technology Officer at Taylor & Francis. So basically, I have responsibility, or my teams really have responsibility for really bringing all of sort of the platforms and systems to life and operating those systems that effectively provide our kind of means of enabling the sort of scholarly journey from consumption or ingestion of kind of content through its production process to ultimately sort of distribution, and then making it hopefully accessible and available globally to the world. And, you know, I should say, my background, although now I'm obviously in the industry of scholarly publishing, is really more from sort of a perspective of sort of technology kind of more broadly. And, you know, and my own experience of technology, you know, across the years is oftentimes we think of information technology as kind of technical systems, but really they're socio-technical systems. They, you know, deeply involve people and interface with and interact. And oftentimes technologists can sort of heavily emphasize, because it's the bit that we're passionate about and sort of know best, the technical side of these socio-technical systems. And we sort of forget about the socio side of it. And I think, you know, when that happens, technology can be used, as we've seen throughout history, all different kinds of technology for both good and for bad, but very rarely for passive reasons, right? And passive kinds of outcomes. And so in that sense, I think this kind of conversation around how we democratize knowledge, what that means, how to sort of manifest that in systems that will actually further all of your missions as scholars, right? You know, those of your students who are attempting maybe to learn from content, how to do that in a way that gets that right. And, you know, we don't sort of find ourselves where we might sort of find ourselves around, like with social media today, where we've kind of democratized something, but I'm not sure that it's actually democratizing knowledge. There's a significant spread of untruths that sort of have come about from the ways that sort of systems have been configured rightly or wrongly, and how that kind of manifests. So, so in some ways, this panel for me is as much of an opportunity also to learn and hopefully sort of share perspectives on how I might approach these things as we try to bring to life in kind of a systems-based way the kinds of things that are important to all of you and your work practices.
Thanks, Paul. Well, thank you all for your introductions. And as I said earlier, I think we all have very different perspectives on this topic, and it's going to be interesting to explore some of these ideas in a bit more depth. And just picking up on what you've just been mentioning, Paul, I've sometimes heard democracy referred to as sort of the least worst of all the political systems. And of course, nothing is ever perfect. Democracy, as we've seen, playing out across our TV screens, doesn't always bring unrivaled benefits to everyone who participates in it. And maybe we should start by thinking about that parallel between the democratization of knowledge or knowledge economies and their sort of political ideology. Is democratizing knowledge always a good thing? Does it always create benefits, or actually are there some unforeseen challenges that crop up along the way? It can mean different things to different people. So let's have a little debate and discussion around what are the good aspects, what are the positive aspects that we've all experienced and seen as we aim to open up knowledge and open up the system of knowledge transfer, and maybe start to explore some of the areas where we've had some challenges. I'll throw the ball first of all across to Nadia, maybe to discuss a bit about how she has experienced this opening up of research and whether it's brought unrivaled or unmitigated good along its way.
So the short answer is no. I could stop there, but I'll kind of talk a little bit about why this proposed opening up of knowledge is unequal, right, and not the same. And some of the opening comments by my fellow panelists have already shared right there is, geographical and regional differences, access to technologies, and unequal access to technologies, language barriers, and then just Western style norms of how, what we publish and how we publish and who gets into certain journals. But I can focus probably most concretely on the case here in the United States. And I'll talk a little bit about how authors from minoritized and underrepresented backgrounds oftentimes find themselves pushed out of publishing because their work is seen as niche or narrow, boutique, right? And really what this is doing is ghettotizing knowledge production into certain journals or outlets. And that has really dire consequences for tenure, promotion, merit raises, right? Keeping people in the profession, making sure that there's a strong pipeline of scholars who are able to teach the next generation of students and to really help advance, again, knowledge production by communities that are oftentimes the subject of studies, but aren't actually having scholarships that's produced by members of those communities that are able to offer new, different, novel, or original claims using the focus or the narrative on that community in a way that is not pejorative or set up in a deficit model. But on the other hand, right, for those who are writing from the global South, who are trying to get their scholarship that wholly fits within the realm of, right, the kind of research or the scope that U.S. journals will be publishing in, because of language barriers, different kind of access to quality of research, right? So the quality of how the data is collected, the ways in which the data is vetted or the analysis is vetted, prohibits some of these manuscripts from being published, right? So oftentimes as an editor, I'm seeing things from the global South that are much more descriptive in nature, that don't have, that really lack a strong theoretical foundation in the ways that we think of this right here in the West, right? And so to send those manuscripts out to reviewers, it takes a lot of ingenuity on our behalf as editors in the US, right? So we have to set up a system where the editors try to see, is there any way that this manuscript can make it through peer review and not just be a desk reject? Then it's finding the reviewers who are able to, as objectively as possible, right? And we know that objectivity is not a real thing, right? Like we all bring our sets of bias and different ways that we understand the world to doing political science scholarship. But it is a real challenge, right, to find reviewers who are who can give these type of manuscripts a real honest read. And sometimes, right, it's not just, or most times it's not just the language barriers, but how these studies are operationalized and how they can speak to larger or more global phenomenon, which is usually not a standard that in American politics, at least my specialty is in American politics, where white male or white hegemonic male studies, masculine studies, are asked to do, right? So if they're studying a phenomenon in political science using very positivist and again, white male hegemonic masculist norms are taken for granted. And anything that you call into question that challenges by using an oppressed view or an epistemology of the oppressed to analyze the theoretical foundations or a new way to think about approaches to the data, those things face a lot of backlash. So yes, I will agree. I'll just to wrap up. So my quick answer of no is also really guided by the ways that this opening up of knowledge production, or even these creations of new spaces for knowledge production, like the Journal of Politics, Groups, Identities, have differentiating consequences for scholars of minoritized backgrounds in the United States and also scholars in the Global South.
Thanks, Nadia. That's a great way to set the ball rolling. And I'm going to turn to Taavi, because I think in your research, Taavi, you've looked very much at how the move towards open access has, this transformation of the process of scholarly communication has in some ways reinforced some of the biases or the inequities that in many ways it was trying to resolve. So by tackling the problem in one way, it's almost created different problems in another. So maybe you'd like to develop that thought a bit further.
Yeah, I think basically I agree with Paul was saying, that interested in the social aspect of technology, so social technologies, that just as the internet was supposed to liberate us all, or whatever the latest technology is, that I think that it's always contingent which way it goes, and same goes for open access as a form of publishing, that it's not either good or bad or democratic or undemocratic. It can be either or both, and then it's up to us, perhaps as scholars or those working for the publishers, to sort of try to steer it towards the destinations that we'd like to see it go. And I think for me, this like democratization of knowledge, as it's in the panel, I think I'd rather speak then of democratization of production of knowledge. That I obviously I realize what's meant when people speak, or sometimes I realize what's meant when people speak about democratization of knowledge. But I think that the democratization can also be a bit like neoliberalism in some other contexts, that it means everything and absolutely nothing. So I think then when it comes to democratization of knowledge production, then it goes to the questions that I'm perhaps more interested in. And to put it as easy as possibly, for me, democracy is a form of decision making, one person, one vote. Whereas then you could say that there are many alternative, more prevalent ones where, for example, $1, one vote. And then to even have these two options, then you can start having debates which sort of decision making should apply to the structures of our knowledge production, and who should be the ones deciding on these things. And yeah, I guess I'll leave it at that for now.
So in a way, the fact that the model is shifting from one of paying to access to of paying to produce now and paying to publish has had this impact on the ability of all to participate, because you're now having to fund the means of production and distribution.
I think for me, it's that now that these transformations are taking place, it sort of makes obvious certain structures of decision making, and it can be used to politicize them, but maybe it's not used to politicize these structures, and then they will reproduce them in the forms of open access that will be established in the coming years. But I think personally, and that now would be a good time to make explicit these structures of decision making, and how are we deciding upon our knowledge production, because now the tectonic plates are shifting, and now we can have a debate before they settle in somewhere else. So that's why it's important to have panels like this, I think, to have as many different voices discussing these things, and not just end up having some form of OA by sort of default, that you just stumble upon one version and never really have a proper discussion. Why should we have that particular version? Because some of them, like you said, can reproduce existing inequalities or produce new inequalities in the field of knowledge production.
Euris, I see you nodding. Would you like to come in and make some comments on how you interpret the concept of democratization of knowledge, and maybe what are some of the challenges that you've faced in your work?
Yeah, Yeah, maybe some comments, because I think indeed there is an overlap or something that is similar to democracy and how we approach science, but I think there are also some differences. Because in democracy, it means everybody can vote. And we don't have any norms or any rules on that. But in science, it works, of course, a bit different, because we first of all want science to be honest. We want it to be reliable. We want it to follow a certain methodology. I think that's a very important pillar of the scientific method. And of course, peer review, when the editorial control is meant to secure that method, whatever is applicable to specific areas, is followed. So democracy in science doesn't mean everybody can publish. It means, of course, everybody should participate in the scientific process. I think there's also a difference between publishing and publishing in specific journals, because the way the ecosystem is organized is that you have specific journals or outlets for specific areas. And indeed, it's true that some are more general and some are more specific, but I think that's also kind of the nature of the of how scientific output is organized in specific communities with specific topics. On the other hand, of course, we want to make sure that everybody can participate in science and have equal access and opportunities to get published. And indeed, I think there are many challenges there. There are, for example, the language barrier. I'm not a native speaker, so I can a bit relate to that. And I think we have to work really to make sure that the thresholds to participate in the publication process is as low as possible, and we give people equal chance. Means a chance to read and to access content, but also to get published. So meaning we support them in whatever way we can. So yes, I think it's a concept we can really use, but there are some fundamental differences due to the nature of science and publication that we have to be aware of.
Your point about language is a good one, and in many ways it isn't even just whether it's English language versus another language. It's how a concept might be expressed in a way that isn't accessible to a marginalized community. At Research for Life, we've recently published some best practice guidelines for our partner publishers on how to communicate their waiver policies for their article publishing charges or any other kind of publishing charges that they levy. Because although from the publisher's perspective, they might say, well, we don't exclude researchers without the means to pay APCs because we have a waiver policy. But what they have failed to always appreciate is that the way that the waiver policy is communicated is very unclear and very inconsistent. And we did some spot checks. We looked around some of the publishers' websites, and the policies were different. They were in different places. They were just communicated in ways that were very inaccessible to the very audience that they were designed to help. So our best practice guidelines have been very well received, because I think publishers have perhaps not appreciated that they might have to use different terminology, different approaches to communicating. I was intrigued what you were saying, Nadia, earlier about the narrative style of writing from within different communities, and I think this is something that we need to get better at understanding. In the communities we work in the 125 countries that Research for Life services, many of them just don't have the legacy of scientific publishing within their institutions, and they don't have the mentoring networks within their institutions to help them understand and navigate the whole system. And so, this is a way where the global community can maybe come together and help navigate through that process and help to provide those mentoring and relationships. So Paul, you're a technologist within Taylor & Francis, and your challenge is to somehow convert some of these social transformations into a technical process. So give us some thoughts about how this democratization process has played out in your world.
Yeah, and I'm happy to do that. And really, like, the story that you sort of just tell is a great example of that type of thing, right? Like, I mean, as technologists, I've got a team of folks that do design work and user experience work and developers who code up things and folks that test it and people that run it. You know, there's a lot that kind of goes into, you know, even just operating kind of fairly basic, what seemingly are fairly basic systems at the sort of level of scale that, you know, that we have to operate at. And, you know, they have lots of sort of technical capability to deliver on a thing. But, you know, the great challenge for us many times is sort of like, we don't know what we don't know, you know, and if there sort of is any primary message that I guess I could sort of offer to sort of this group, kind of a plea to everyone here, is that you have a tremendous agency to be able to help us sort of build the future that is sort of most ideal for you. And like, there's oftentimes a difference in kind of user experience. Most of my career actually has been spent in sort of health informatics. So that's an area where we're technicians sort of and technologists building systems for clinicians, right? In like the context of a hospital, you know, nurses or doctors, right, on sort of a floor. And you know, if I'm sort of envisioning a clinical decision support system for an anesthesiologist, you know, like, how that actually gets manifested in the life of an anesthesiologist when they're delivering care, how I might imagine that, you know, sort of sitting in a room like this, you know, scribbling things on a whiteboard as technologists like to do, versus like what the anesthesiologist is actually going to tell me when I have a conversation with her about how that's really going to work in her life. That's the kind of insight that we really need. And I think one of the things that often happens, particularly around sometimes these kinds of issues, is policy is sometimes made at a sort of institutional level, sometimes at governmental levels, but there's not sort of as much sort of direct feedback from the sort of individual end user or communities of end users represented, and hearing the diversity of voices, because in the technology, we can actually accommodate quite a bit. Like, I can, even though it might be more complex and more complicated, we can build systems that provide that kind of diversity to understand that, you know, the way in which we present a given idea, you know, needs to be different for this community versus that community. And you know, and like in the context of Taylor and Francis, where we publish sort of so widely, both in geographical terms, but also in terms of disciplinary terms, it's really important for us to get that right and to understand that, you know, there's a whole series of communities within communities, and to build systems that are able to sort of accommodate across and between, and create a kind of an experience that isn't sort of uniform for everyone everywhere, because actually that doesn't meet their needs best, right? What like meets needs best is to understand the specific needs of individual cohorts, right? And sort of to build systems that are responsive, you know, to those types of environments. So the conversations that we've had around this are, you know, really kind of quite encouraging to me, because it's exactly that helps us get to, you know, moving away from this kind of abstracted worldview, even if good and, you know, sort of well-intentioned, but is sort of so generalized, to be able to move into a space where we actually understand specific needs and then can bring that to life. You know, that's kind of quite powerful. And obviously I'm representing kind of, you know, one academic publisher in this context, but I think that is in many ways the sort of spirit. I know sort of most of my peers and sort of other publishing organizations as well, and I've certainly seen it in the context of the work that I guess TM does. There's a strong desire on our part to sort of build systems that enable that, both in terms of the production of knowledge and then also the dissemination of it, that really is sort of fit for purpose, because we believe in the power of it. But it really is a plea, I think, on our part to say, help us to sort of understand that nuance, and also make sure that your voices are heard amongst kind of policymakers as well, that are sort of influencing decisions, which to sort of Taavi's point, might well have unintended consequences, even though they come from a very well-meaning position, because we are in a moment of change. If you get that right, that could be tremendous. But if you sort of get it wrong, it could be sort of precisely the change that, you know, you all would not want to see happen. And to me, that would be sort of heartbreaking.
Yes, and I think that plea for cooperation and really a real sort of furthering that sense of community amongst those who produce the knowledge, consume it, and those who get it, but from one point to the next and sort of within the system is a really important one. Nadia, I'm just wondering, in your experience as a journal editor, do you have any kind of hot tips for the sort of interventions that you have seen to be most effective at engaging some of the more marginalized communities?
Yes. So thank you for this question, because I was really anxious to talk about the good things that we can be doing, right? So the first is that leadership matters, right? Look at your editorial boards and your editorial teams. Are they representative of the discipline? And that's probably a problem if it is, right, given the ways in which political science, looks particularly at the higher echelons, or those that have received rank of full professor or distinguished professors. But leadership matters for two reasons, right? One, it tells possible submitters to your journals that there are people that do research that look like you, and this journal might be a welcome home for your research. They're more likely to give it a look, fair look, if because they themselves might be doing similar research or come from communities that you might be studying. So, but on the flip side, right, so that's the answer, right? Leadership matters. The flip side, though, is that we know from scholarship is that women in particular are less likely to be asked to serve on editorial boards, even though they're great number of reviewers who do the work that editorial boards should be doing. And we know that women are also less likely to be on the editorial teams, right? And so the majority of teams and political science journals are heavily male-led. And even if they're not, even if the journals might have skewing towards parity, they are heavily male or masculinist identified dominated, right? So it's not just having the bodies there, but who gets like the outsized say. And so again, like, you have to think about the ways that we should be including marginalized groups and women into the field. The other thing is that I think there has to be a new way that journals seek out reviewers, they seek out authors, they seek out engagement with the community of scholars that they want to be a part of. So it's one thing, right, to just say, here are policies, kind of like how you were alluding to earlier, Andrea, right? That, but making sure that the community knows your policies, right? Making sure that the community is aware of what's happening, not just posting some things on an obscure point on your website, but actually getting out and talking to the groups that you want to be a part of. So what we do at PGI, we've held coffee hours at conferences or workshops that are frequented by minoritized and underrepresented scholars. And it's just a time for I do like a spiel of like, here's a journal, but really it's me in a room listening to people, letting them ask questions, right? Most times people just don't have access to editors to ask very basic questions in a supportive space where people don't feel, dumb or ignorant for not knowing the answers, but doing it in a community of their peers and knowing that others maybe sitting next to them might have similar questions. And it also means a lot, right, that I'm a Black woman who is going to these spaces to talk with people that do the kind of research that I do or come from the kind of communities that I come from. So building that kind of community ethos of like going to the community, not just telling people, hey, we're here, but really asking them to be a part of the community. And then we also have gotten real in our journal about, what makes us successful in comparison to other journals. So at the start of the pandemic, many journals were, for lack of a better term, freaking out about what this would look like for gender parity in the profession, right? So are those women or femme-identified folks who have disproportionate burdens of caregiving, are they able to publish? Are they able to do reviews? Are they able to be engaged in teaching and scholarship in the life of the mind? And when PGI did our own analysis, we were starting with a leg up. We already had more female authors than other journals. So we all took a hit, right? But we started off in a better place. And then I also was very, very aware that, because I myself live this too, right? So it's not just like, right, this is some kind of like abstract thinking. I have 3 little kids, ages 6, 4, too. And so I knew what it was like to try to write an article or review something and then have a kid sitting on my lap or asking, for their bottoms to be wiped or new snacks or something like that. So what that meant is that I had to reach out to scholars that were similar to me and just say, I understand what's going on, because people would write in with like horrific stories, not just of, dealing with COVID, but also what their new, working situations look like. And it was just being very, very lenient. So really making people know that, this is a once in a lifetime, hopefully, pandemic, and that things have changed, so that I don't need people to write to me with embarrassment and say, I can't do this, or I thought this review would take me this long, or to get this R&R would take, rise and resubmit would take me this long. Now it isn't. So I was much more proactive in saying, look, I understand life is happening. Things have turned upside down. If you need an extra month, if you need an extra 3 weeks, this is what we can give you. And then also saying to people who are writing in and saying, I submitted my journal article to you, a month and a half ago. I haven't heard anything. Like, wake up call. We're living in a pandemic, right? The people that we're relying on to make sure that your manuscript is intellectually sound have other things going on right now, right? But it was that frank conversation, and this, taking down the walls and pretending that, that life isn't happening to all of us in varying different forms, I think it's a very different approach that we took at PGI than some of the other journals that were continuing to send out these auto-generated messages from the system that said, hey, you're 2 weeks late, you're a month late, what's going on? But actually writing these personalized messages that let people know we're all human, right? We're in this together. And so these very small but meaningful touches matter. And I would encourage other journal editors to do the same thing.
Thank you. I like that idea, the we are all human message. But of course, in some areas, we're moving more and more into the use of artificial intelligence. And are we going to be able to capture that sense of humanity as we move to improved or into increased automation? And Euris, do you think there are some pitfalls there? Is some of the AI or techniques might end up actually making the situation or reinforcing the biases, rather than trying to solve the problem they're trying to help?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because technology can do both good and bad, and I think in every situation, but also here in science. So going back to the earlier discussion, so for example, when you think about language, I mean, AI has been incredibly effective in translating from your language to English. There are AI tools now that can really improve your English and make sure it is sound on a scientific level to submit it, so also lowering the barrier there. So I think in that respect, it can definitely help and lower access and create equal opportunities for people, also for non-speakers, to get published in journals. I think there is one risk indeed around AI, and that is, of course, how AI works. It strengthens patterns. So it looks at certain characteristics like the university you work from, or your publishing history, or the subject field you publish in, or even the country you come from. And based on these characteristics, it depicts or predicts whether you will be successful. So it takes the past as a way to predict the future. And which that means is that it strengthens patterns of the past. But of course, science should be inclusive for new ideas, for new people from organizations that haven't been published before. So we really have to make sure that that doesn't happen, and it doesn't make us even more conservative as we as humans already are. That's also something we addressed in the white paper around AI that we published this year, to make sure that whenever AI is implemented, and that happens in a more and more among publishers, that we have to do that with care. And we have to make sure that the negative effects or the unintended consequences that are, that apply to all technologies do not materialize. And one of the most important principles for us is that, as we call it, sharp machines helping creative individuals. So it'll always be human beings that are behind the steering wheel, and human beings and have an open mind and trying to be aware of certain biases. Maybe one anecdote, I think about 10 years ago, a company came to publishers and said, hey, we have this prediction tool. So if you implement this, we analyze papers that come into a submission system, and we can predict, how successful they will be. And this is exactly the challenge I talked about, because then you basically get the Matthew effect, the rich are getting richer. And all of the editors basically said, no, we don't want that, because we are afraid that, that machines will take over with all the consequences I talked about. So The good thing is that publishers, but also editors, are aware of these consequences. So as with everything, we have to be very careful how technology should be applied, and again, make sure that science remains accessible to all on the level of publishing and as well as readership.
So yes, and as we kind of focus our thinking around the challenge of redressing some of the imbalances rather than reinforcing them, I'm interested to hear from Taavi, who spent a lot of time working in the Lebanon, and I'm not sure if any other countries as well, but certainly the contrast between Finland and Lebanon must be pretty stark. And perhaps you could share some of your experiences of efforts to redress those sort of economical and geographical imbalances that maybe haven't always gone to plan, or maybe they have. It'd be interesting just to hear your experiences.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, there obviously, I mean, it goes without saying that there are differences. The first thing, obviously, then, that even if I'm there, I'm affiliated with the University of Helsinki, hence I have access through that to everything that almost everything that I want to have. But you sort of do realize that you're lucky in that sense. But then, I don't know, should I say this in this context, but I just can't resist. In some ways, it's not that big a problem, because it's not so much the technological questions that are, for example, me or others in Lebanon prohibiting to accessing knowledge. It's the paywall. And as we all know, there are some sites that shall not be named here that you can easily get around the paywall. And this sort of also ties me back perhaps to this discussion about the enabling things for technology in the work of publishers. I mean, I wholeheartedly agree with what previous speakers were saying, but at the same time, let's not forget that many of the technologies which annoy me or us as researchers most are there specifically to do the thing which annoys us most. That is to block access to the thing that we want to access there. So I think in certain ways, technology, even if you work in a country or a university or context where you're not so privileged in many ways, I think technology has already made a huge difference, but it's done it through these illegal means that people now have access to most of the stuff. And then the question comes with what to do next. Should we somehow try to institutionalize this access that already technologically exists, or should we try to clamp down this access that is already there and then provide some bells and whistles for the ones who can afford them?
So yeah, so and of course there's this concept, this idea that once content is open, and once we have open access to content, you don't need to go to an illegal site because there's no restrictions on access, and so the challenge the challenge about removing paywalls hasn't disappeared entirely, because there's still plenty of paywall content, but that the shift to open access is starting at least to mean that there are different challenges now. So it isn't so much about the access to the content. The access is there, but one of the concerns that we've come across in Research for Life is that the corpus of content that we make available, it's an enormous collection of content. It's 20, 25, 30,000 journals, 100,000 books, 125 different online reference resources, all made available by the participating publishers. But that it's almost seen as a sort of a reinforcement of the subscription model, because it's providing privileged access to the registered institutions, but doesn't permit them access to it doesn't allow them to publish in that content. It's still kind of a one-way system. It solves the access problem, and the access problem, as I say, is sort of increasingly becoming solved through open access. But as we said earlier, access to funds to pay publication charges, understanding that waivers exist, just being able to navigate, to differentiate between predatory publishers and legitimate publishers. These are all new challenges that have emerged since the kind of the open access movement really, started with all the best intentions. but maybe led to some unforeseen consequences as well. We've just carried out a survey, an online survey of our 750 highest using institutions, and our contacts within those institutions tend to be the librarians, the intermediaries, rather than the actual end users. And we had a huge number of responses telling us that they are increasingly under pressure to publish. So their institutions are seeking to publish more and more, but are coming up against significant barriers and significant challenges in their efforts to become recognized for their research. And these are quite extensive, these challenges and difficulties they experience. And so we're thinking, well, how do we expand the scope of what we provide, or the services we offer, so that the challenge isn't just about providing access, but is really supporting the research endeavor within these institutions and creating that equality of participation. And I think if we go back to the very first question, what does democratization of knowledge mean in essence? I mean, to me, it means equality of experience. The experience of being a researcher should be the same for with all its challenges, irrespective of who you are, where you are, what subject, what discipline you have, what financial means you have. That there should be an equity of experience. So we are looking at how we can help in our particular geographical focus there. Taavi, did you want to come back on that?
No. I mean, I agree with what you said. I was just thinking that it's also this sort of how can we provide these things to others, or perhaps those less privileged. I think in the open access debate, if you look at it on a global level, it would also be a good idea to look what's already been done in the areas or geographical areas that we normally think as the global south, or the ones that we then take our research and make it open and accessible to them. Latin America is often given as an example, where there is already a well-established infrastructure and culture of open access publishing, and then to push that aside and then have this sort of Anglo-American debate on how do we hegemonize a specific form of open access publishing. I'm sure it's often done with good intentions, but also this goes back to the things that who should be the ones that get to decide on these things, and where are the sort of forums where this can be debated together, and not sort of in a form of charity or just pushing for stuff without listening to others.
Paul, maybe you could comment also on the ways in which perhaps technology has helped in practice to remove some of the barriers to that sort of publishing opportunity. Do you see technology reaching out to new communities and attracting content from new communities that haven't traditionally been participating?
Yeah, no, I certainly think there are opportunities for that, both gains where we have made them, and also, opportunities to kind of continue to further build upon it. I mean, I think the idea of kind of creating an equality of experience is a good one, as long as we do that by raising the bar for everyone, making the experience better, as opposed to trying to sort of default to some kind of, lowest common denominator for all. Because I do think that is sometimes a little bit of the risk in just sort of letting things play out to sort of their inevitable conclusion, if someone doesn't have a kind of, curatorial, editorial influence of sort of where you go, right? Because you do have to make sort of explicit decisions about those things. And some of what we've talked about, whether it is a matter of using AI to make content more accessible, or to overcome certain language barriers, that's certainly, we've made gains in some of those areas, particularly I guess I would say on things that are kind of reasonably good literal translations of a thing, right? I always worry a little bit because the technology doesn't sort of do a great job of understanding kind of the nuance of what is really meant by it. So you might sort of understand or hear the words or read the words, but I'm not sure that the technology isn't to the point of fidelity that the underlying meaning is necessarily fully conveyed or able to be sort of picked up, by the receiver in that kind of context, at least as it sort of exists today. As Euris said, I have my own sort of high degree of skepticism of sort of leaning kind of too far into the use of technology to at least assess sort of certain dimensions of kind of quality or aspects of quality, in part because you have to sort of define clearly what we would mean by sort of quality, right, in that kind of context, and that has different meanings to different people, and they're sort of making normative judgments around it, and that's, in some ways sort of not so much for the technologists to say. I think what we actually owe, though, when we bring things to life, is to not make them some kind of opaque box, right, that something gets fed into and something magical happens, and then something pops out the other side, and we don't really know how it occurred, because I mean, we know of many examples of where technology has been used in that way, and it either reinforces a kind of an existing power structure that we wouldn't want to continue to reinforce. I mean, certainly we've seen that, vis-a-vis criminal justice here in the United States, right, as sort of but one example of that playing out. But I mean, there's just, from the ridiculous to the sublime, there's many other examples of sort of AI technology, doing something really good in a particular context as learned, but you sort of change one variable that you weren't even thinking. I mean, there's an example, I don't know if it's apocryphal or not, but often told around artificial neural networks, where the United States government at one point used it to try to detect effectively for smart munitions like tanks, which are ours, which back in this period of time would have been Soviet tanks, right? So that way a smart bomb would sort of not blow up the one and only blow up the other. And they got the way you train a neural network is basically you show it pictures, right? And every time it sort of got it right, you give it the, thumbs up, and every time you get it wrong, like, you press the wrong button, and eventually the system learns, it figures this out. And it got pretty good at detecting what seemingly was a US tank versus what seemingly was a Soviet tank. And then they brought the technology out to sort of a live fire exercise, and it just blew up everything, right? Everything into smithereens, which was really, as we sort of learned after the fact, was the only sort of thing that was only one of other two options that were going to happen. Because what actually they taught the system by using these photographs of US tanks, Soviet tanks, what it learned was actually to assess the quality of the photograph, because that was sort of the variable that it sort of keyed into. So if you would have had high fidelity images or low fidelity images, that's where it was making its decisions upon. And like, that's precisely not the kind of thing that we want to have, to have happen, because that takes a long time to sort of understand even where that's occurred and how to unravel, right, these kinds of of realities. So yeah, I think as we implement sort of technology to kind of deal with this, or to kind of bring policy to life, it's important that we do it in a way that ensures quality, ensures access, but does it in a way that really maintains kind of standards, because I think that's sort of as we have seen in kind of other contexts of technology and sort of information dissemination, just kind of throwing things out there and using popularity, as kind of the standard for is it good or truthful, gets us into a whole lot of trouble, right? And yeah, I see nodding heads on the panel, and I suspect others watching this probably are doing the same thing. So I mean, that's where really it's sort of incumbent upon all of us to figure out what we need to do, and where we are going to make sort of normative decisions, and with the appropriate guidance, we can, from a technology perspective, you can probably then bring that to life, but just you have to understand what it is you're trying to achieve and why.
I'm just going to remind the audience that if there are any questions that have occurred to you, or you want to challenge any of the comments made by a panelist, then please do add your comments to the chat box. I haven't seen anything yet, so we'll carry on, but that's we have about 30 minutes left in this panel, so plenty of time still to take questions. And actually, you used the word policy just now, Paul, and it reminded me that one of the things that I think is an important aspect of this debate around democratization of knowledge in the context of open scholarship is the role that's played by the policy makers, the funders, those who are kind of supporting the research financially and have aspirations for the outputs of research to have a positive impact on our communities and on our lived experiences. And I'm just wondering if the panelists have any comments on the role of the funders, and maybe comments where funders have tried to impose policies to improve the situation, to improve open scholarship, but actually maybe have not appreciated that the policies and the requirements that they're setting are placing new barriers for some of the participants in the system. I can think of open data mandates where researchers are increasingly being required to publish their data sets openly, and this can create quite a challenge for many users, certainly in countries that we work in, the global south. I can see a few nods. I don't know, Nadia, in your discipline, is this a challenge for you that you've come across?
Yes, yeah, completely. I had two thoughts on the matter, and thank you for raising the data openness or data sharing, right? So I am myself just like very livid against this because I'm a qualitative researcher. I'm an interpretivist. I use ethnographic methods, and my data set, and with women of color, my data set and the things that are told to me are not widely available. I should not share them widely available, right? Because this reduces the amount of, I think, trust and authenticity that participants in my research projects speak with me. And so this idea that all data is created equal, that there aren't different communities that have different access to power or privilege or oppression or marginalization, and that this data could just be readily available, really doesn't take into account the different kind of power relationships that that research subjects and researchers bring to the table. And I also believe, and also just as a journal editor, I'll come back to this other point, but as a journal editor, we've had for lack of a better word, trolls who really pick on, I can't think of a better word for this, but really pick on minoritized and underrepresented scholars and go through their data with a fine-tooth comb to see if there might be a mistake or a gotcha. And when that happens, the person who found this mistake in the data does not directly go to the scholar themselves to say, I think you made a mistake and interpreted this incorrectly, or might you have coded the data incorrectly. They post it on a blog or a website and then talk about it on Twitter. And then there's a whole following of people who then pile on. This happens to minoritized communities and people that are studying minoritized and underrepresented communities in unprecedented ways. And so that's why I refer to these people as trolls, because it's not for the good of trying to make better science or to correct a mistake that was made by scholars. I think if that were the true intention, then these people would have gone to those scholars, via email or, some other kind of way and said, take a look at this. But instead, I'm contacted as a journal editor, or I see this on a blog post or on Twitter. And these are really attacks that are being lobbied towards people that do this particular kind of research. And then the other part I wanted to mention, kind of when Paul was speaking about how these access to open access isn't equal. I see these policies, particularly here in the United States, where departments are trying to raise their research profile or help to push the promotion of junior faculty members. So departments might pay for open access for their junior faculty members or for a certain number of faculty members in their department as a way to increase their citation count, so that when they go up for tenure or promotion, or when there's an outside review of the department, it boosts their ranks because they're saying, oh, the scholars in our department have been cited so many times by so many people outside of the US or in the US, and look at the downloads for these articles. And this is a tactic, right, to boost, I think, to inflate these numbers. But this happens by schools that have the money to pay for this, right? And so that's where the unequal part comes in. So if your university does not have the money to kind of manipulate the scores in this ways, then your rankings will stay low, or you might not be able to you're not viewed as favorably when you're coming up for promotion or tenure, or even merit increases. In my previous institution, my department chair instituted this policy for junior faculty members, but really ignored associate faculty. And we know that they're, particularly women and faculty of color, are oftentimes stuck at this associate level, at the associate professor level, because they are often asked to do more service because they are tenured, but don't have the time then to put towards their own research. So while the policy was useful really for helping to kind of bolster junior faculty members and getting them over the hump to become an associate faculty member, it really left a group of associate professors really out there still fending for themselves, right? Where they could have benefited from having higher citation counts that would have helped them to go up for promotion to full professor. And we know in the American political in the American Academy, particularly in political science, there is a dearth of number of women and women of color, minoritized groups that are at the highest rank of professorships. So these policies that on front face value look like they're doing good. Yes, let's try to help our junior faculty member, but we're not thinking about how they might be having these disparate effects on other groups. So again, like these are all ways that well-intentioned policies don't play out equally the same. And as an intersectionality scholar, I think about the words of Mary Masuda, who asks us to think about the other question, right? So on the face value, if this policy looks racist, but how also might it be sexist or transphobic, right? And there are just ways that I think we as scholars need to be much more intentional, not painting this broad swath about we're trying to help this particular group or we're trying to take down barriers in this particular ways, but think about what are the unintended consequences. And so far, right, I don't think we've done a good job of asking ourselves these other questions.
Thank you, Nadia. We've got a couple of questions coming in that I will come back to, but I wanted to ask Euris the question about this funder influence challenge and whether there's funders with the best of intentions by seeking to further the interests of open scholarship through open data mandates, and obviously we have issues like Plan S through Coalition S, whether these are actually ultimately excluding particular communities from the process rather than being more inclusive.
Yeah, I think, and maybe going back to the two topics that Nadia just mentioned, I think unintended consequences. I mean, we have a very complex ecosystem, and when you push in one direction, you might get a challenge somewhere else. And maybe to start with the research data, in general, the perception is that transparent open data is good for science because it allows science to be more rigorous, reproducible, more transparent, which are important principles that we all work on. So we have actually been working to increase the uptake of tools among publishers to make data available, citable and linked to research data, so that reviewers but also scholars can basically validate the research and also build further on the original data that the whole research was built upon. On the other hand, indeed, I mean, not all data should be made available. Of course, there are obvious cases whereby there's confidential information or sensitive information, but we also try to address that by having several levels of data sharing policies, whereby some data can just be made totally open, everybody is made accessible, or data is only made available upon request, so that things like confidentiality can be taken into account. On the question on the access to publication, I think indeed that is a very important unintended consequences that we really have to solve in the efforts to make sure that accessibility to reading content is made open and everybody can basically read, and not just people working at institutions that have sufficient budget to purchase a subscription from a journal. And now the access is open from the level of reading, but indeed the challenge might now be on authorship. So how do we make sure that people from less fortunate countries or institutions that have less budget, how do we make sure that they have equal opportunity to get published? I think indeed, so we're basically shifting the problem a bit. And I agree with it. It shouldn't be that people with the deepest pockets should have the best opportunity to get published. And that's something we all should be working on to address that, because that is something that really hinders and endangers equal opportunity in scholarship.
I'd be interested in Taavi's thoughts on this. One thing that has concerned me is, as funders of research, and I think of Coalition S, but also the European Union, other the US governmental organizations place requirements on their grantees to meet certain open scholarship requirements. It demands an infrastructure, it demands a support network around that author, around that researcher within their institution. So in the well-funded institutions where they have, maybe a well-funded research support office or a library, they can develop the skills and tools. And here we've heard of publishers developing tools to support that effort. But you're inevitably going to create a have and have not scenario where researchers, they may be doing excellent research, they may be top quality, they may have no language challenges at all, they simply don't have the environment or the support network to help them comply with the mandates that the funders have set down. And I wonder, Taavi, if you've seen this happening in the sort of the contrast of maybe a well-funded institution and where you've been working in Beirut, where an individual researcher may be doing good work, but the institutional support isn't in place.
No, unfortunately, I can't think of an example of that specific thing. Obviously, that's something that I've thought in my own work. For example, even when publishing in PRX, there was a deep breath of sigh. I sighed deeply when I realized that I submitted my paper before there was some change in the article publishing fees or whatever, which would have been an X euros after publishing it, and then I would have had to at least negotiate with my institution, because my other institution has this deal with Taylor and Francis, but it only lasts always because it's I don't know how it works. They say that 1,000 researchers can publish one article, and then when those run out, then you reset the clock by the end of the year. So if you're submitting towards the end of the year, then most likely you have to pay it through some other means. So it's not something that I've been lucky, but it's something that I've already sort of had some close calls with, having to try to navigate this new world of open access. But then the policymakers role, I think, like, it's a good question that you raised, and like I think I write in the paper that autocrats or dictators, that's the term that I use there, can make enlightened decisions, but that doesn't take away the fact that they're still autocrats or dictators. So these funders, for example, they can do good stuff, but then if we go back to the sort of democratization of knowledge, it's not democratic in any ways, or at least an argument can be put forward that it's not democratic. They get to decide because they have the money. So from this, good thing might come, or then maybe not. But I think this is a debate as well. And these blanket policies, I totally agree that there's so much variety. As with the technologies, what's the need of researcher in different specialties and different fields? So with the data question, that I tend to think that open data as well is a good thing. And when I collected research data in Jordan interviews, I asked them to sign a paper that can I deposit the anonymized version into the Finnish social science data archive, or whatever it's called, after I've sort of used the data for others to use. And in that context, everybody was fine with it, but I thought that because I was interviewing people so high up in the political sort of ladder, that I figured that they might be feeling safe or comfortable enough to let me publish the data in an open access format later on. But obviously then there's questions that maybe go a bit off topic for today's discussions. But for example, I was thinking that would the answers still have been different if I hadn't asked them to give me the permission to make it open access? Was the data different that I got because I asked them that it it made open access. And then, yeah, to sum it up, that these funders force theoretically sort of put on a blanket policy that everybody must follow this line. I think that's a dangerous one. But then first for everything, I think to defend the funders, at least when you look at some of the Finnish debates or the universities that are pushing for them, I mean, sometimes it might be good to assume that they're not as stupid as you might think that they are when they propose these policies, that maybe if you can just highlight that in some specific fields with some specific data, there are some specific problems that might have to be accounted for. It's not outside the realm of possibility that these funders might actually agree and sort of have a bit of fine-tuning for the different needs of different people.
Yes. We're creating, I mean, the world of research is sort of hyper niche in many ways, isn't it? I mean, there are lots of very specific communities with very different characteristics. You know, can we equate high energy physics with modern language research, for example? You know, lots of differences to take into account. But there has been a question from Nikolai here, say Nikolai Pavlov, who's asking specifically of Nadia. He's from Eastern Europe, and you know, his point is that Eastern European academics and scholars are equally underrepresented in the research material. And do you have any ideas of how Eastern European scholars could boost their standing in scholarly publishing?
Yeah, I agree. And thank you for that question, Nikolai. You're right. We don't get as many submissions from Eastern European authors. And when we do, I've been the editor for about 6 years. So this is the institutional memory part. I think we've passed through to peer review about 3, and from Eastern European scholars. And I don't believe any have made it through the peer review process. So that unfortunate recount allows me to just validate your position or the preamble of your question. I think the ways that Eastern European scholars can boost the standing in scholarly publishing, particularly in the West, is to try to, unfortunately, mimic as much of the format, not necessarily the content, but the format of what the journal articles where you're trying to publish look like. So what that means is getting a copy of a journal article that is similar situated to what you're working on or what you're writing, and put it kind of like side by side to your computer while you're working and mimic the format. So what is the way that the author that's been successfully published, how have they formatted their theoretical argument? You know, ways that they lay out the introduction that really purports this is the main puzzle that they're trying to answer, this is the literature that they're speaking to. Then how are they laying out the data and the methods that they're using to explicate this theoretical assumptions or claims? And then walk us through the discussion or the analysis of the data in the same way that you've seen this in the article. And then follow up the same way with the conclusion. And so it's not to map on your content in the same way, but mostly to mimic the style of how things are written, because the style is what is legible to reviewers, right? Like people will pick up an article and say, oh, I know what this is. And then we'll evaluate the claims and the merit of the article itself without dismissing it because they don't know how to make heads or tails of what this article looks like. And unfortunately, like that's a lot of what we see from scholars that are not, non-Western scholars, or that they are writing in a format that just doesn't, make sense to Western readers, right? To Western reviewers who have to pass this along to peer review. And things might be as simple as, the way that you set up the theoretical problem, right? The way that you set up the work that you're doing, but writing in a way that at least says to someone, I know what this is so that I can evaluate it. And then they get to the claims and they're not, just dismissing the article out of, just because it doesn't fit within the model that they're used to.
Thanks for those tips there, Nadia. I just wanted to throw in one last challenge, really, which is about the use of English language in all of our publications. I mean, we've talked about the fact that automated translation services are getting better to convert into English. we talked about the language barrier experienced by many researchers, but should we assume that research has to be in English? I mean, it's the norm for many disciplines, but what about many parts of the world where English isn't the lingua franca? I'm going to say, should we recognise that that maybe there are some global shifts taking place, and if we want true democracy, then we should probably also aim for multilinguality. Euris?
Just go back to that, Andrea. Well, I think as with everything you choose, it always has disadvantages. Let's say we introduce multiple languages, let's say Chinese, Spanish, and English. Well, then you still have the issue, then some languages will fall out. So I think it doesn't really solve it. But you introduce another problem, is that the English can't read the Chinese. Yeah, I think talking about democracy, this is probably the best possible system, still not perfect, to have. And I really think we should rely on an editing services, translation services. Maybe it allows us to allow publishers to publish in their own, authors to publish in their own language, and then maybe the reader can look at the translation. Maybe that's an option. But once we lose the shared language, I think it will be very bad for science in the end.
So in essence, the ability to communicate effectively trumps the specific choice of language.
That's well put, yes, indeed. Yeah.
Taavi, you've obviously never been held back by being a Finnish.
No, I think publishing is okay. Again, going back, because my university is happy to pay my language proofing before I submit, so I'm fairly sure I pass few hurdles before it gets to the editor. Whereas those who can't afford it, for me, it's always been more like when I have to speak. That's because now I can't have the language editor here sort of correcting my speech, and you just always think you end up sounding stupid. Anyhow, what I was just trying to think that there is clearly this sort of publishing in English in global or sort of international journals versus local. I think Sari Hanaf, he's a sociologist from Lebanon. He's done research in the Middle Eastern context, and he has this, that either you publish locally and perish globally, or you publish globally and you perish locally. Meaning that either you take part in these global international debates, but nobody's interested, or it has no relevance to the actual location where you're doing your research, or then you sort of target the actual community and the location, but then that's not going to get published anywhere. And I don't know how these could be. Oh, and there's the third option, perish locally and perish globally, which I guess is maybe the most common. But how these two could somehow be bridged. And yes, maybe here the translation thing as well, that if in the future it's even easier to automatically translate articles and text, then maybe you can publish it in English and then just sort of press a button, and then comes the local version, which you can then modify more to the local context or these sorts of things. But
I think this this sort of dilemma and trying to get the balance right between sort of a domestic publishing need and an international and wanting an international profile is a tricky one, and it certainly came through in the survey that we've done at Research for Life, where there's the institution is increasingly focusing on international publication, but actually when we look at the type of research, that the research is actually going to make a difference in the context of the sustainable development goals, for example, it's often highly localized and it's very practical, and it needs to be communicated in order to be applied at a local level. And if you're reaching out to local communities, then you clearly need to use the local language to translate your research. So it's very different circumstances, very different scenarios. And I guess what we have in our wonderful world of scholarly communication is that blend of options, makes it such a dynamic and exciting place to be. So as we come to the end of our panel session, I'm going to ask each member to maybe have some final thoughts on how to avoid the bear traps, really. What are your sort of final tips? Maybe that is to do with setting technical standards, or looking at editorial processes. But do you have any final words of wisdom to share with our audience today about how we can try to avoid going down a rabbit hole and making the situation worse than it currently is? I'll start with you, with Paul.
Yeah, I guess I would say, as I kind of, indicated in sort of my initial comments, I think a lot of it is just appreciating the kind of agency that you do have, and I guess my plea as sort of representative publishers is, for those of you that have maybe seen the movie Jerry Maguire, there's a little bit of this, talk of like, help me to help you, sort of the speech that goes on between Jerry and the character that's played by Cuba Gooding Jr. And I sort of feel that way, right? Like, I think, at least for my part, and I think this is true of my colleagues, we really want to deliver something that does address needs, and recognizing that those needs are quite diverse. That's sort of every topic we sort of touch on here. That's sort of what I hear, right? Like, nuance matters, context matters. It kind of depends. There's lots of things that we could understand in a local context that would be applicable globally, but also things that might seemingly be applicable globally wouldn't be able to be applied sort of locally, it just, because why? Because it sort of doesn't work for you, right? In sort of your particular context. And yet the benefit of sharing those ideas and being able to exchange them are part of it. And technology can help with that, and we'll get better at sort of helping with that. But that kind of nuance and context and understanding the differences between disciplines and even differences within disciplines is really critical. So I guess I would just sort of encourage everyone to really lend their voice to us, to policymakers, to basically folks in the ecosystem that are, either building it or influencing it. So that way we can try to get it right. Because, the thing that I would worry personally the most about is that we spend a whole lot of time and energy and effort to sort of reimagine systems, only to find that actually we didn't sort of get out of that the change that we were seeking in a sort of more macro sense.
Thanks. I'm going to butt in because Nadia has to run to teach a class, I think. So we're so grateful to your participation, Nadia. It's been fantastic hearing from you. And
Thank you.
And good luck.
Okay. Thank you. Bye, everyone. Thank you again.
Bye-bye. So I'm going to jump to Euris to see if he has any final pearls of wisdom about avoiding the bear traps.
Yeah, well, maybe one thing I want to mention is that equal opportunities doesn't necessarily immediately lead to equal outcomes. So I think there are other, for example, economic differences between countries that can lead to specific demographics having more success. So I think something to bear in mind. I think bias is a very important thing that is just very human, but that it even more pertains to machines. So let's be wary of that. But also to stress that we have a lot of tools in the toolbox that can already counter the bias. We talk about peer review a lot. Well, there is, of course, the double-blind peer review system whereby the reviewer and even sometimes the editor can't see the name or the origin of the author, which is one of the methods we have traditionally in order to counter bias. So I would just also encourage people to think about the existing tools we have to make sure that the effect of bias is as small as possible.
And vive la différence, as you say. We live in, we should celebrate our differences as much as try to normalize our processes.
Yes. Yes.
Taavi, any final thoughts?
Yeah, first I have to say that when I think of Jerry Maguire and publishers, there's another famous quote from the film that maybe comes first in mind, but that's a good thing that it's not necessarily what the publishers are thinking, at least if Paul is to be trusted. And of course I trust him. No, I think, I don't know any wise concluding words, just that I think in all these debates, I think the point is that I think we should try to be as conscious as we can about these different trade-offs and these different decisions and these different biases. And maybe it's even more if you look at the sort of open access advocacy and this sort of really pushing for open access. Sometimes you get this picture of this beautiful democratic open space where there is no structure, it's just freedom, and I tend to believe that that's not possible. There's always some sort of structures of power and some sort of exclusions and biases, and I just hope that us as researchers would pay a bit more attention to those when it concerns our own ways of working or doing research or publishing. Because I know, and I'm looking at this now from political science or world politics perspective, which is my background, that we're really good at pointing out what's wrong out there in the world, but we tend to be quite blind to our own practices within the university. So I hopefully people would pay more attention. And I think maybe the youth are the future. The younger scholars, maybe they're a bit more conscious of these things. Then the problem is that they have no power and they want to get a job, so they have to play by the rules. But let's see.
Great. Well, I'd like to thank all our panelists again for a really stimulating debate this afternoon, and I hope everybody out there has enjoyed it. And thank you for your participation. I'll just, my final comment will be, I'm reminded of a former HR director at one of my previous companies who always used to remind us that we may live in a democracy, but we certainly don't work in one. So goodbye. Thank you, everybody.